What it is, Ihsan Samsudin, back with another episode of Benefit Continuum, where our purpose is to get the knowledge and the wisdom from the people who have it to the people who need it. And today, I have a special treat for you, Mohammed Vadee. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Shukran for being here. As we said, the long-awaited episode. Alhamdulillah, shukran for being here and taking out the time. I really, really appreciate it. So just to give context to the beneficiaries, and I call my audience the beneficiaries. So the theme of today's podcast is how can we attain Allah's pleasure through the Shari'ah financial planning. And we have Mohammed Vadee here to talk about that because he is actually a founder of a Shari'ah financial planning business. And we'll get into that. But for briefly, just to introduce Mohammed Vadee according to the LinkedIn profile, because as it is my custom on the podcast, I leave the nitty-gritty of who my guest is to the guest. But briefly looking at the LinkedIn profile, it says entrepreneur, technologist, board member, executive, and coach. And some of that I personally experienced with you. Alhamdulillah. So if you can, for the sake of the beneficiaries, just dive a little bit into your history, into your childhood, schooling, and how you have walked the journey to where you are today in the Shari'ah financial planning business. Given the fact that you come from an IT background with almost 2 decades there, it would be very interesting to understand how it is you walked that journey to where you are today.
Sure, Ihsan. So it's never a strength of mine to kind of talk about myself, but I think we'll get into some of it. I love the beneficiaries aspect. I think it's very special to be able to podcast to beneficiaries, and hopefully there's some benefit from this talk as well of ours, inshallah. So in terms of my background and my childhood, I've lived in different cities. I've had the opportunity and pleasure to be part of different industries as well. And I suppose, as we believe, everything happens for a reason. And a lot of my journey to date has led me to where I am today, alhamdulillah. And I do see it as a privilege and an opportunity for having gone through certain experiences in my life to be able to be here today. So a bit of my childhood, I grew up in Johannesburg, the vibrant city of Joburg, obviously the city of gold. That. And in fact, there's deeper. I've actually had a stint of my childhood in Zimbabwe as well.
Oh, wow.
But that's another podcast, I suppose. But I did spend a bit of my childhood there, very young years, for a short while. But majority of my childhood was spent in Johannesburg. I schooled there, I did tertiary there. And it was through my early years that I actually, discovered that my passion for technology, while in school still, was really there. And I always seen it as an opportunity for myself to learn more about technologies. And a lot of it was self-taught. But I think the early interest at young years kind of drove my passion towards technology and ultimately pursuing my career in technology. I then had the opportunity of moving to the city of Port Elizabeth for some time. And that's where my career really ventured into different industries and different sectors. So even though my core was technology, I was exposed to multiple industries because I was there to provide technology services to industries in manufacturing, heavy metal, industrial plants, and so forth. So one gets a real appreciation of technology being an enabler for big businesses.
So the LinkedIn profile doesn't actually give everything.
It's never a strength of mine to be able to talk about these things. But alhamdulillah, I think we've had a rich tapestry of experience and life experience in general, which has alhamdulillah led us here to sitting here with you today.
Alhamdulillah. And then how was that transition then from going from technology, because I can hear and I see through the work you're doing, very passionate about technology and the effect and the future that it will have, the future impact it's going to have. How did you transition from that to a Shari'ah financial planning business? What got you sparked on that interest?
Yeah, I think I'm a person who tries to always look at things from a perspective of the bigger picture. And when you look at technology and the role it plays in the world, it's not just an isolated industry. It's not just about the early years of technology was you were called the IT guy and, you were lucky to be in the basement of the building. And, that's how people see in the IT department.
Yeah, really
you were
in
the basement of the building, and when something went wrong, then you kind of, found you and where you sit and what you do. I always described IT people's careers like a pilot. It's the day that they're not working where you actually see things go wrong. So similar to a pilot, when they're not actively flying the plane, that's when you actually see it go down. So technology professionals are very similar to that. So technology, in terms of what it does for industries generally, It enables industries, it enables
Yeah.
businesses. And my passion for technology has always been about what can you do to enable a
Yeah.
business or solve a business problem. So that's where I started my career in understanding the bits and bytes, in terms
Yeah.
of pure technology, but then being able to make a decision around how do you use that skill and knowledge to be able to solve business problems or real world problems.
Yeah.
So that's where, my journey with technology
Could you maybe give
started.
us an example of what you mean by how you use technology in that way? Like a sort of practical example.
So I'll give a very abstract example.
Yeah.
In my early years, I worked for a project, which was a construction project. And one of the challenges they had was how do they monitor? It was well before cell phones were around, without giving my age away. But it was well before cell phones and video technology was around that,
Yeah.
you could just video call someone. So here was a practical challenge where there was a rural project being undertaken with the building of a hospital in a rural area. And the project managers and the skills required were sitting in main cities. So they couldn't actually travel to this area all the time
Yeah.
to monitor progress of the building of the hospital. So they actually had to develop technology at that point in time of a handheld camera, which then was used to go around the hospital on a daily basis to look at where the progress was made from building the hospital.
Yeah.
And that feed was then sent through to people who were sitting in the main cities to actually look at that. So that's a real technology example, which gave a solution to which would have been a problem at the time where
And you
people
were part
couldn't
of
travel.
the
I was part of the
development of that.
solution of that. So
You're
in
talking about
terms
like
of
coding type of stuff.
coding was the background. In that particular example, there was no
Okay.
coding involved,
Uh,
but it was more solutioning for it. The
Yeah.
concept of having a held-on camera being built to be able to walk around the
Yeah.
facility. So that was a solution. I'm
And I
talking
think
many, many years ago.
That's interesting because that's really, like you said, is before cell phones were around.
Absolutely, absolutely. So it was solving a problem at the time.
Yeah.
We're not having the technology readily available. However, creating something that could solve it. And that's just a very practical example in
Yeah.
my early years where we had to come up with a technical solution for a business problem and a
Yeah.
business challenge.
So where was the introduction to coming back just to the question? Where was the introduction into that sparked the interest into the Sharia financial planning? Because we're working in the financial services industry, and according to what I've seen on LinkedIn, you were in the financial services industry for about 2 decades. So in that time period, where did the Sharia financial planning part spark for you? Where did the interest spark?
Yeah. So being in the financial sector, I mean, it's a very fast-paced sector. It's something that's always changing. It has various elements of it. There's a regulatory aspect, there's the consumer aspect, and it's always evolving. And it's a very fast-paced industry globally. The particular, as they say, where the nugget landed was during COVID. I think sitting in a big corporate, one of the big national companies in South Africa, being part of them for many years. But during COVID, it became very evident that our Muslims in particular were quite vulnerable by not having financial security in place. So, we all unfortunately experienced the examples where we lost people, we lost those close to us, whether it's in the communities or just family members. But what was becoming very evident was this financial security for those families that were impacted during
Yeah.
COVID. Now, it happens all the time, right? It was just for me the realization during that period where I seen firsthand examples. And I'll give you a real example, Ihsan. A leader in our community, an Islamic leader in our community, would have unfortunately got ill and passed on. And the family of that individual was unable to do much beyond that in order of carrying on with their lives from a financial point of view.
Sure.
And then you start understanding underneath the surface why, that particular, community leader didn't have the security from a financial point of view, which is an indictment on all of us as Muslims to look
Yeah.
after our community members, especially those who are leading us, in the deen. But it was an example where they would pass on and their families would be left with very little choices of how to continue the very next day. And so more and more examples through Allah's Qudrat reached me, and it became very obvious to me that the vulnerabilities that we have in our Islamic and Muslim community was very evident.
Yeah.
And I couldn't just sit back and ignore that. So, while I knew there were solutions out there, which met the requirements from a Sharia perspective that were permissible, yet we were not being able to put it in place where it meant the most and it was needed the most.
Yeah.
So therefore, it drove me down a path of really going underneath the surface, exploring what solutions were there, and then me making a decision around leaving, my position at the time in a corporate business.
That must have been difficult.
We'll come to that. I think it's a journey of note,
Yeah.
and one learns a lot through that journey. And I think there's many people who go through similar journeys. I'll share mine, inshallah. But being able to take that and go where it matters, and you could sit in a corporate ivory tower and try and do things at an arm's length. But often one needs to get to the ground level to be able to make a direct impact.
And I think just something to highlight, something that stands out for me, and I think is beneficial to the beneficiaries listening, is that you actually took a step out of your corporate position to start a business where there's a lot of uncertainty, and you were earning a certain salary, and you're in a comfort zone basically, and to step out of that for the sake of what? For the sake of the community. And I think this is a very big point to make, and because it tells the audience, the beneficiaries, that we're not here, we didn't do this just for the sake of our pocket. Or you didn't do this for the sake of your pocket. It's here, you've done it because of very specific reasons, experiences that you've gone through. Alhamdulillah. So I think it's a very important point to touch on there. And so what was some of the groundwork that you had to go through? And this, we're not yet going into the business itself, but this is just at that very point you started to, you're experiencing the community leader passing away and the family suffering through difficulty. What groundwork did you have to put in for yourself to sort of make that decision to jump into this Sharia financial planning business?
Yeah. I think even though you're in the industry and you understand it at a very superficial level, if I could say that, one of the first learnings for me was to actually go underneath the surface, to really understand the structures and what's in place from a Sharia product point of view when it comes to Islamic finance and the financial sector, basically. So one of the early lessons for me and work that I undertook was really to understand the products that were out there that fulfill these needs and go a bit deeper underneath the surface in terms of really understanding from a Sharia point of view, how were they permissible versus the more conventional ones which are impermissible? And what were the couple of things from a layman perspective that made it understandable for me that logically I would understand that this is actually a better choice for me.
Yeah.
And it's the better choice for my family, and it's the better choice for my well-being, from a financial well-being perspective. So I really needed to spend quite a bit of time in understanding what the mechanics were of some of those products. And that was something I wouldn't have done before. It was very much at an arm's length, a superficial length. I was the person who picked up brochures and looked at them.
Yeah.
And you look at the face value, the Sharia compliance certificate, and that's where it ends for you. For me to be able to go underneath the surface, understand the scholars who are actually involved in setting up those products, engaging with them for my own understanding, and with the purpose of taking that message out there to the ground. Because as a financial industry firm or brokerage firm, we play a specific role in being able to distill that message.
Yeah.
The scholars and the designers of those products have a very particular purpose. They're there to be able to make sure it aligns to the deen, that it is permissible. But when it comes to explaining that to clients, to people on the ground, you can't expect them to always drive that message. And I think that has been the biggest gap that we've seen in the last couple of years. So for us to be able to understand it and bring that into our company, where we're able to express that at a very meaningful and understanding level, where we connect with people on a one-on-one basis and we share that message, and they can interact with us, they can ask questions about it, and hopefully we can engage with them to also get their understanding a bit clearer.
I think a very important point that I'm extracting from this part of the story is that you came from a position of a layman, not knowing much, and I think majority of Muslims in Cape Town, South Africa, are just at the level of the brochure. And I want to highlight this because it shows that in order to understand how something is actually Sharia compliant, it requires some effort. It's not just for the scholar to know. You, being a layman at the time, working in the technology space, you came into this and the groundwork you had to do was first go and study. That's my point I'm making here for the beneficiaries. It's you look at the scholars and you look at the people working in industry, and it's like that there's some negative rhetoric going around. But in order for these things to come about, it takes a lot of knowledge, study before actually being able to come out with something and saying that it's Sharia compliant. And I think this is a good segue into the actual topic, the meat of the topic, which is the how to attain Allah's pleasure through Sharia financial planning. Seeing that is where you are currently working in that space. So I think a very important question is, what is financial planning? Right? What is Sharia financial planning? And that Sharia being a bit of a buzzword currently, how does that compare to, or how is it different from conventional financial planning?
So financial planning in nature is very much a specific need and conversation with an individual. So you look at anyone, no two people's financial situation is the same. Absolutely not. So we start off with financial planning. We'll come to the Sharia aspect. But every person's financial situation is different. Their needs are different, their goals are different, their aspirations are different. Where they see themselves going in the future is different. So everyone starts off from a point of they have unique needs. They have unique goals. They have a unique and personal journey which they are on from a financial well-being point of view. It doesn't matter what you have. You can have little, you can have a lot, which is a very relative thing, but everyone's journey is different. Some people have more basic needs, some people have more lavish needs, but everyone is absolutely different. And I start off with that point because that by nature is what a financial plan should be. It's something that's very unique. And if you meet a good financial planner, they recognize that uniqueness and they almost tailor make a plan for you.
Yeah.
Right? Now you take the Sharia aspect. As a Muslim, one of the requirements should be, I'm not just looking at my financial affairs in isolation of my deen. As Muslims, we understand Islam is intricate to our day-to-day lives. And so is the financial part of our day-to-day lives. We learn about buyu. Buyu is a topic taught in a lot of Islamic institutions. And it's about the financial aspect of our deen, which is a very big part of our Sharia. And as part of that, to be able to look at your finances, but the uniqueness that I am a Muslim, how will I be able to apply my financial plan with the element of the Sharia overlay on top of it? So this is where the uniqueness comes in. There's no difference fundamentally in terms of any human being's need, goal, aspiration.
Yeah.
But when you overlay it with a unique aspect, like I have to take my deen into account to my financial plan, what element does that bring on top of the financial plan that adds a unique aspect to it? And that's where Sharia financial plans emerge.
I was just going to highlight now, that I asked the question, what is Sharia financial planning? And I was hoping you'd actually touch on and separate that the fact that financial planning in and of itself is just a skill. It's something that can be taught, or it's something that you practice. It doesn't necessarily mean that it is a Sharia thing. It's something that you use to plan your day-to-day, your life and your future, and how to protect it, how to invest, etc. And that's the financial plan. But the Sharia part of it is, how does it align to the principles in the deen, and making sure that every part of your financial plan, it's not contravening the Sharia. And in order to do that, you actually have the knowledge. Again, coming back to the understanding of what is the Sharia. And in fact, what I've learned thus far in Islamic finance or the Sharia is that the mu'amalat, where buyu, that you mentioned buyu, which is business, trade, etc., that it actually formulates 2/3 of a Muslim's life, in the entire life. And mu'amalat is not just buyu, it's criminology, it's marriage and divorce, etc. And finance is one chapter of that. And that's what we're talking about today. And it's just to show, Islam is not just about ibadah, worshipping Allah, but this in and of itself is a worship, because for you to make sure that your financial plan is Sharia compliant, and that important word compliant, that it's your financial plan complies with all the laws of the Sharia, and that's very important, I think.
Yeah. So let me come in there because I
Yeah.
think there's one example that comes to mind
Yeah.
where we should be seeing Islamic finance be an everyday thing. So every human eats. We all eat. We all need food. We have to consume food, for
Yeah.
the well-being of our bodies, minds, etc. So we all, every human being, strives to eat at some point during the day. And again, as a Muslim, you will also eat. However, the food will be halal. Now, there's an example about a basic need which every human being needs to fulfill. But from an Islamic perspective and a Muslim perspective, you ensure that the food you consume is halal.
Yeah.
Right? Now, very similar, we should be looking at finance in that way. We transact, we do things on a daily basis, we buy things, we consume things, we plan for the future, etc. Now, if I overlay my deen over that, what is the way that I would actually do that?
Yeah.
And like we would go and buy a particular halal product to consume, what is the halal product that's there available for me to consume for my financial well-being?
Yeah.
So I think we've got to see it as something as basic as that. And it's almost never hopefully we're very fortunate in South Africa where we've got a lot of halal options from a food perspective. It's almost now second nature. You go, you look at the certification, but people over the counter, even though the institute is halal or not, you can ask them, is the food halal? They'll know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
They'll say, yes, it's halal. There's our certificate. They can verify it, etc. And that is a very comforting thing for us to know when we're consuming food.
Yeah.
How do we take that level of awareness, consciousness, and accessibility to financial services so that when you're looking at, okay, I want to buy something, you have a very similar mindset to say, well, is it Sharia compliant? Is it not Sharia compliant? Is it in line with my deen? You would never ever think about buying something that's not halal to consume from a food perspective. So why do we make it acceptable to almost consume financial products which are not halal?
And it's similarly, that brings to mind also, what's the difference then between slaughtering Sharia compliant way to just any other way? Like there's procedures and processes in place in the background to make sure that the meat is halal. So too on the financial side, there are procedures and processes in place to make sure that a financial product can be stated that it's Sharia compliant.
Absolutely. And some of those things are minor, but from an Islamic perspective, they're major. The fact that there's an intention, if I take the analogy that we're talking about in terms of the animal, there's intention when you're slaughtering the animal with Allah's name, with your intention, which is very pure. When you slaughter the animal animal still dies. That's arguably what happens. But the intention aspect would either constitute it as halal or haram. Now, I'm no expert in the food or, slaughtering, but a minor aspect like that, which holds a lot of weight from an Islamic perspective, determines whether that is acceptable or not. And very similar in the financial services. Maybe the mechanics are slightly different. Yes, there's intention, but there's other aspects in terms of extracting interest, etc. The mechanics are slightly different. But the possibility of cleansing funds as we look at cleansing, the food is very similar in that regard, where there are minor things that people do or institutions do in financial services, again, which hold a lot of weight in the deen that make it permissible for us to consume.
And that's very important because it also takes away from the argument a lot of people say, there's no difference between interest and profit. When if you go into the background of how the thing actually works, you will see that there is a major difference between interest and profit, but that's a whole podcast on its own. So we won't dive too deep on that.
Yeah, we almost went down the food category and we were almost, going down the halal and ram about food. But I think it's a very good analogy, Hassan, when we look at it, for our beneficiaries to understand it. And maybe one last example for me. It's like, you could say, if you use that example about, well, is it interest? Is it profits? What's the difference? It's the same thing. Look at the killing of an animal. Whether you slaughter it, according to the method that we taught, or you shoot the animal dies. It's the same thing. But look at the difference. Would you ever think about consuming an animal which was shot and, then produced into something which wasn't slaughtered in the correct way? You would never think about it, right? But there's subtle differences. The end result is still the same. The animal's dead and you can consume it. But the process to get there is very different. So very similar. When we look at profit share versus interest, a lot of the time it's the processes that surround the outcome which constitute whether something is permissible or impermissible.
100%. So getting into that, And to that point, that touches on Islamic finance. So if you can just touch on briefly what is Islamic finance, because when we say Islamic finance, it doesn't really mean financial planning or Sharia financial planning. So how does Islamic finance tie in with Sharia financial planning?
Sure. So Islamic finance, in terms of its topic, it's very vast, very broad. We should look at it from a perspective of how it deals with the very sophisticated structures from a financial system, right up until how we go and we, buy our daily needs in the shop. It's everything encompassing, absolutely everything in there that talks to Islamic finance. One would even argue it even refers to how you earn your money. That is also Islamic finance, whether it's permissible, impermissible.
Yeah.
Right? Now we're going quite deep here, but the point is it's an entire ecosystem. When we think about Islamic finance, we shouldn't just think about it's something there in the corner. It's something quite vast, it's something quite broad, it intricates, or it includes everything in our day-to-day lives. Where it touches us from a practical perspective, it includes things like banking. It includes things like our charity and our contribution to those less fortunate. It includes things like our wills and fiduciary. So when we pass on, what would actually happen? It includes protection, takaful. It includes our investments, And lastly, it probably also includes those who we seek advice from in making financial decisions.
Yeah.
So there's basically about 6 elements which it should include, which encompasses everything related to Islamic finance. And like I said, there's a lot more sophistication in different levels.
I like the last one, who we ask. Because, and it's not a knock on any of the scholars, but we have to recognize that we can't just ask any scholar. They are specialists in Islamic finance. Like you get someone who's a faqih, you get someone who's a lawyer according to Sharia, and then you get a financial specialist, then you get a medical specialist, etc. So you can't just speak to any person. And I'm highlighting this because there might be people from the beneficiaries listening that might want to go ask the local imam. Now, he might be, if he studied it, but if he didn't, he wouldn't be knowledgeable on the topic. So you have to be, like if you want to know about how to draft a contract, you're not going to go to the doctor.
Yes, there you
You're going to go to the lawyer. Yeah. So similarly, amongst the scholars, there are people who are specialists. So go ask the people who have the knowledge,
So, but it brings us to a very important point. So we look at financial advisors who play an important role in what we spoke about earlier. They're there to see your financial well-being, and they are experts in the financial industry. So you go to them like you go to a specialist and say, help me with my finances. Help me to see if I'm saving enough, if I've got enough protection, if something goes wrong, which I haven't planned for. Am I doing the right things when it comes to financial well-being? So those are financial advisors, and many of us deal with them. A lot of us, when we work, we get exposed to them. If you go into a financial institution like a bank, you could meet someone there, or you could call your general insurers, etc. So we start off with that specialist skill.
Yeah.
But for me, what's important is we start recognizing a Sharia financial advisor. And this is someone who, to your point, is skilled up in understanding the Sharia aspects when it comes to financial matters.
Yeah.
And those are your experts.
Yeah.
Now, one would argue, does such a position exist, a Sharia financial advisor? So if I'm up and coming, and if I want to go and study a career, we know the basic careers, I can be a doctor, I can be a lawyer, I can be this. Does anyone there recognize a Sharia financial advisor as a career? And they look at, okay, what is actually needed for me to become that specialist? And I believe we're on the path in South Africa to be able to establish Sharia financial advice as a profession, as a discipline, which becomes accessible in supporting the Islamic finance environment.
I think I would like to touch on something here which my mentor taught me. And this is to give respect to the people that's working in the industry. He told me, it would be better for you to call yourself, if you work as the title of the job position, as an Islamic financial advisor, because Sharia financial advisor, I think they are, like we got people like Mufti Faraz Adam, they are considered Sharia financial planners or Sharia financial advisors because of the level of knowledge they have. So Sharia has a very heavy meaning to it. So when we say Islamic financial advisor, it's more to the person that is doing the financial planning, and the Islamic financial advisor would actually go to the Sharia financial advisor to seek further assistance or advice with regards to questions that they get from the clients. And I just wanted to make that point to give respect to the scholars, for what they are doing in the industry.
Now, it's a very good point, and I think also remember we're not as Muslims isolated from the global economic system.
Yeah.
So when we use labels like Sharia, which is very common knowledge for you and I, what we're referring to, but for someone who's not versed in Islamic itself, you know,
Yeah.
that may be very foreign to say why Sharia. So to the point that you've raised, perhaps Islamic finance, you know, is more versatile and more easily understood
Yeah.
to the global system we're part of. So it's a very good point where we're able to also, you know, position ourselves in a way that others can understand
Yeah.
as well. And it's very important because as much as we think we're talking about a topic here that's exclusive for Muslims, it's actually not.
Yeah.
The Islamic finance system is a system which should be open to all. And that in itself is a very good point, which leads us to perhaps a point where we look at it and say this is not only exclusively for Muslims. In fact, if you look at global statistics, the vast majority of growth in some of the Islamic financial instruments have been through acquisitions by non-Muslims into those funds.
Oh, that's interesting. Eh?
Right? Because if you look at the ethical component in the makeup of those instruments and financial, you know, structures, when investors, no matter the faith, look at it, because there's an ethical component of that, it speaks to sustainability, etc. There's a natural gravitation towards that
I think
versus anything
that's
else.
a very important point. Like, how do people compare Islamic finance to what is happening on conventional side? What's the closest thing? And you just mentioned it, like the ethical aspect, and then there's the ESG as well.
Yeah.
So just based on my brief research that I've done, there's a very close, how do you say, comparison between the two. And most people won't notice it, but if something is Sharia compliant, it's automatically ethical. And it automatically complies with ESG
Yes.
rules as well.
Yeah.
This is sort of built in. This is the system of Allah.
Yeah, exactly. So it's interesting because in the last few years, the label of ESG, and you know, to just unpack it, is environmental, social governance.
Yeah.
You know, meaning ESG, and this has become a buzzword. You know, before, especially in business circles, we would hear about sustainable business. You'd hear about doing business in a sustainable manner, etc. ESG has become the latest buzzword. And it refers to sustainability, but there's a very strong ethical aspect to doing that.
Yeah.
Now, we know a lot of the times we are taught at a very young age, do things for goodness, do things with righteousness. And a lot of that has come into the business world and holds a lot of weight.
Yeah.
And I speak a lot about a conscious customer, irrespective of faith. There's a heightened conscious customer in everything that we do. From the local supermarket on the corner, where people go there and they're faced with choice between two products, and they will choose the one that perhaps, does better for the environment than that one that doesn't. So we're faced on a very practical level every day, choices that we need to make.
Yeah.
And ESG has become very topical, specifically in the financial world, where, it holds a lot of weight for that particular type of client, where they're looking at all aspects, the environment, the social aspects, the governance aspects, so that, there's been a myriad of examples where irregularities have taken place over many, many years. The ESG funds, kind of give someone a feeling of, well, these investments or structures are doing the right thing, by those metrics, environmental, social governance. And there's a very strong correlation between what Islamic finance and Sharia funds, if I talk specifically in investments, align to with the principles of ESG. So that's the most common that we see aligns in conventional terms. There are some, nuances. Obviously, a company dealing in gambling or alcohol could be classified as ESG because they do things right for the environment, they do things, but we know from a Sharia perspective, they wouldn't be permissible.
Yeah, I was
there are a
actually
few
gonna,
nuances.
I was actually going to ask now, just because I said earlier, and this is so that there's clarity in this, because I don't want people to become, especially the Muslims, to become confused now. We said there's a very close comparison between Islamic finance and ESG and ethical finance. If something is ESG compliant and it is ethical, it follows the ESG principles, does it automatically mean it's Sharia compliant?
No, not necessarily. Yeah, I think the correlation is there. Again, if you come back to the food analogy, just for purposes of practicality and understanding, sometimes you get a restaurant that says, we buy halal meat, for purposes of consumption. And then you sit there and you think, okay, that's fine. I could perhaps eat here. But then you look a bit deeper and you see, okay, no, maybe there's a bit of contamination happening, so therefore I'll stay away from it.
Yeah.
Very similar type of thing when it comes to ESG. At a broad level, there's a lot of similarities between Sharia or Islamic finance and ESG. A lot. Broad spectrum comparison is there. So one is able to at least start from saying, listen, there's a lot of close similarities and they perhaps one and the same.
Yeah.
But when you go under the surface, you could find some anomalies where it relates to, some industries or some businesses that may not align to the Sharia.
Yeah.
So one just has to be careful. And again, to the point that we discussed earlier, these are where the scholars, be able to guide us. These are where the experts can guide us, because there are some elements which are not completely aligned between ESG and Islamic finance.
Okay. So again, just to highlight it, just because something is ESG compliant does not necessarily mean that it is Sharia compliant. However, the opposite is true. If it's Sharia compliant, it would be considered ESG compliant.
That's a very good way
well.
to put it, yeah.
You know?
Because if you look at the structures and the methods that one follows from an Islamic finance point of view and going towards Sharia compliance, it would cover a lot of those aspects.
Yeah.
So absolutely well positioned.
So going into, and we probably mentioned it now, but again, I think repeating things is very important, because then it sticks in people's brains, in their minds. Why would you say Sharia financial planning is important to a Muslim?
So I think if we look at it from a point of view from a Sharia perspective, the continuation of deen is one of the responsibilities we should have as Muslims. And that's in all aspects. We should be able to live our lives where we're not only going to preserve Islam for our generation. The intention is to preserve Islam that it can continue beyond when we are just here on this earth.
Yeah.
And financial planning or Sharia financial planning has a very similar objective, so that we're able to do the right things in the purest sense in our lifetime, that those can after us will also gain and continue with Islam. If, for argument's sake, we a generation that becomes absolutely bankrupt, Allah forbid, it would make it extremely difficult for the generations to come to do a lot for the purposes of Islam and the growth of Islam.
Yeah.
We live in a world that is economically driven. It holds particular focus in terms of building infrastructure, etc. So for the longevity of deen, it's important that in our lifetime we conform to certain aspects, that we preserve deen for those who come after us.
Yeah.
And we should look at that responsibility when it comes to our financial affairs as well. Any person, and you highlighted, I do a bit of coaching as well. One of the tricks, or not tricks, but one of the advices I would give people when it comes to, business coaching is we must try and leave what we involved in better than when we came in. Okay. So that means, as Muslims, if we found something in a particular way, strive towards keeping it in a better state for when we're not here.
Yeah.
And that would be very, very apt for, finance. So let's leave more wealth for those after us. Not just more wealth, but the type of wealth, the purity of wealth.
Yeah.
Leave it in a sense that they'll be able to do much more with it in a responsible manner. And therefore Islam can thrive and Islam can build.
Yeah. And in order to do that, it requires a lot of planning. This reminds me of the story of, it's in Surah Yusuf, where Nabi Yusuf was tasked with interpreting the dream of a king. And there was that 7 years where they had to plant seed. To me, that planting ties very well in with this conversation. It's the planning phase. Because we don't know, that king was lucky to get the dream from Allah and inspire him to notice that after 7 years, there's going to be 7 years of difficulty. We don't get that, unless Allah inspires us as well. But we don't know what the future holds.
Of course.
So that first 7 years of planting the seeds for what's to come, that is the planning phase.
Yeah.
And then the next 7 years, when you face the difficulty, that's where you're able to carry yourself through.
Of course.
But that you're only able to carry yourself because you've put in the planning.
That's
and
right.
then after that is where inna ma'al usri yusra comes into play. That with that difficulty comes the ease. Because the very next verse, after the 7 years of difficulty, there comes a year of abundance. So similarly, in our lives, we experience that same kind of pattern where you go through difficulty and you go through some ease. But in order for you to overcome those things, I would say semi-comfortably, is for you to plan first. And I think this is very important for financial planning and especially for Muslims as well. And the Sharia financial planning has the capability to do that for us. Okay, so now that we touched on the importance of Sharia financial planning for a Muslim, you've started a Sharia financial planning business here in Cape Town, South Africa, called Al-Himayah. And at this point, I would like you to just tell us, for the sake of the beneficiaries, what is Al-Himayah, who is Al-Himayah, what is its purpose, and who does it aim to serve?
Okay. So Al-Himayah classifies itself as a Sharia financial planning business. And simply what that means is we should be there for anyone who aspires to do their financial planning with the extra aspect of conformance to the Sharia or Islamic finance. Al-Himayah means protection in Arabic. So for me, the selection of the name of protection is quite vast in the sense of it should be covering all aspects. We deal with protection of our future, we deal with protection of our current, and largely we want to deal with protection for generations to come as well. So the meaning, the literal meaning of Al-Himayah in Arabic is protection. And I felt it was apt to call the entity Al-Himayah to be able to encompass everything that we've talked about under that particular brand.
Yeah.
It's also important that the company name resonated with those who recognize the Sharia and Islamic finance. We could call ourselves such and such Islamic finance entity, but I think it was a personal decision to be able to have an Arabic name which one can easily identify that this is different. This is not your typical financial institution that just deals with your conventional financial planning. It was very deliberate when we chose the name for Al-Himayah to be that easily recognizable, that it has a bit of distinction behind it, and it has a strong alliance or a strong association with Islamic finance and Sharia financial planning.
Yeah. So in terms of what Al-Himayah is built to do, it obviously means that there needs to be certain solutions available to the market. So if you could maybe just touch on what are some of the current Islamic finance options available in the market that Muslims can use to build a more Sharia compliant portfolio, financial portfolio.
So what Al-Himayah was able to do is, if you look at the different aspects of anyone's financial portfolio, usually it constitutes things like, am I protected in the event something goes wrong while I'm living and after I pass on? So we start off with that from a risk point of view, where we have Sharia compliant solutions which cover, in the event of your passing, what would the Sharia will be, in terms of your wishes and leaving, the wealth behind according to the conformance of the Sharia. So we start off with those risk aspects where we look at products that cover, in the event of my passing, what happens while I'm alive, how are my risk needs met?
Yeah.
If I get retrenched, if I'm able to save for when something had to happen, which requires me to have funds available for that emergency. So all risk associated events is something that we look at, and we're able to assist in the financial planning for those events. Usually those are unplanned events, but you want to plan for them in the event that they happen. Then we look at the investment aspect. So this comes into play where one has a bit of excess funds and wants to see it grow or be there for a rainy day, as we spoke about perhaps the 7 bad years, So one looks at investment structures, maybe for yourself or for your family. We're able to do investments, again, which are Sharia compliant. Then we look at some of the more day-to-day needs when it comes to short-term protection or short-term risk management. This is your normal motor vehicle, house cover that one goes through. Then we look at medical aid, which is also Sharia compliant. So Al-Himayah is able to do an end-to-end solutioning for any client. Just happens to be we have also been able to bring the best of all those available in South Africa and present it in one offering to a Muslim client.
Yeah, I think it would take a whole nother episode to just go through examples, like practical examples of how Muslims can use the financial planning options, the Sharia financial options that is out there facilitate, like for example, buying a house. How do I cover the debt, etc. People like to see the nitty-gritty, and there's going to be that hectic questions about the Sharia compliance and so on. That's why I said that would be like a whole episode on its own. But what I'd like to touch on now is there are these Islamic financial options available to build a compliant portfolio. But is it only restricted to Muslims, or can non-Muslims also buy into the Islamic finance process for building a portfolio for themselves?
It's available to anyone, and I think this is the what Al-Himayah advocates, that even though it's based on Islamic finance principles, the work that we do, the products that we provide, it's absolutely available to anyone. And what's interesting, Ihsan, through my journey is you actually get a lot of interest from those who are non-Muslim to understand, okay, is there a difference? Is there a difference in what I have and what you offer? And there's been a lot of engagement that we have with non-Muslims to actually inquire about that. But, to the point that the solutions that we have are fit for anyone.
Yeah.
It deals with risk events. It deals with investments. It just happens to be Sharia compliant as well. But the need is the same need that anyone would have, irrespective of faith. And the solutions that we have cover the needs that people have.
Yeah, and I think an important point here also is just to state, just because it's Sharia compliant, which I think there's this negative rhetoric again that, if it's a Sharia compliant investment, it's not going to grow. Or there's minimal growth in comparison to what the conventional market has to offer.
And that's such an important point, Ihsan. We live this, and we know on a day-to-day basis there's this myth. And I think it's a myth that has been created by ourselves. It's almost like we've created this myth amongst ourselves to be able to convince ourselves for some particular reason that the funds that are Sharia compliant, because you're limited in selection of shares or whatever the asset class is, that it performs to a lesser extent than your conventional, which is absolutely not the case.
Yeah.
We've, alhamdulillah, seen over the last year, in fact, Sharia funds have outperformed conventional funds. Now, that's a very bold statement I'm making, but it's a fact.
They can go look it up.
Yeah. Look, I would encourage that, because we've seen that, especially in the current volatile environment, where Sharia funds, if I just speak about investments, have actually provided a lot more sustainability and stability during the current times. Now you're dealing with an environment that's, from a political aspect, has been very volatile. It's the year that we've seen the most elections across the globe. We've seen wars taking place. I don't have to talk about that and, the impacts of that at a global level. But these things, these events on a global scale have created a lot of volatility in markets and things like that. Short supply of certain things which come from certain parts of the world. Political agendas are being driven. And all this has a direct impact on the financial arena. And to that extent, you've seen the conventional funds being very erratic. And however, by design, Sharia funds have been a lot more stable because of the choices that we make in the design of those funds to be a lot less involved in things like wars, in things like, political chaos. So therefore, those funds have been a lot more stable. And as a result of that, over the last while, the Sharia funds have actually outperformed those conventional funds. So it's a very positive story where we've got to start using this to be able to create or rather break down that myth that, you actually at a disadvantage having any interest in Sharia in Sharia assets or anything of that sort. It's an absolute myth. And I think we've got to speak more about that, from a layman perspective in terms of how that myth is just not true.
In fact, I think on two occasions, even in one of the master classes that we did with Islamic finance with Dr. Ziad Mohammed, and I think Abdulaziz Davids also mentioned this, that it's crazy to see how much money, Muslims' money, is sitting in the non-Sharia compliant options. And what's happening there is, and this is, I think, and this is why I'm highlighting it, what you're doing when you're investing in those funds is, who are you funding? You're putting the money with them and choosing not to put the money in the Sharia compliant option, which means the Sharia compliant options is going to suffer, and it's going to take a very long time to build because people are not confident in putting their money there. Why they're not confident? This is, I think, why we're having this kind of podcast, is to bring light to the fact that Sharia or Islamic finance has all the tools needed to protect wealth, grow wealth.
Yeah.
you know. And if it is that we can then take the monies that is sitting in those non-compliant funds from the Muslims and shift it into the Sharia compliant funds, now we're looking at a landscape where we can start to build better options,
Yeah.
you know, more affordable options for the Muslims. I mean, how do you get these big institutions that can offer you all the different options? Sometimes you feel like you don't even need it, but the option is there.
Yeah.
How do we then do that as Muslims as well if we are constantly putting the money with non-Sharia compliant financial options?
So Hassan, this is probably the crux of the podcast for me. This is the tipping point of the podcast for me because it's so important. We spoke about earlier a question around the Islamic finance system and what makes it different. The work of your money in the Islamic financial system, your money works a lot harder. It's circulated a lot more. It creates equitable wealth across the system. And we know these things from a dini aspect. Those are objectives that we have. So if you adopt, what we're talking about here, the money is able to work much harder and be much more spread out and equitable for all. And alhamdulillah, I think South Africans, the Muslim South Africans, there's a lot of wealth within us so that we're able to create a lot more sustainable structures and spread of that wealth, which lessens the burden on charity. Not to say that we want to get away from charity, but if we're using the Islamic financial system a lot more active, we should be seeing a lot more evolution in people thriving towards businesses, job creation, etc. So we start producing an economy that's much more vibrant than what it is. And the crux of the Islamic financial system promotes that. It promotes the circulation of money within the hands of people. It's not to say it ends up with someone, it's put away, and that's the end of it. We hear a lot of the time that how many times does 1 rand get spent? Sometimes 4 times, sometimes 6 times. The Islamic financial system promotes the circulation of that money much higher than probably any other system, and most certainly the capitalist system. So therefore, it encourages a lot more economic activity by adopting that. So to the point that we're talking about, when you adopt those funds, as an example, or Islamic financial solutions, generally speaking, it promotes that circulation of money much more than its conventional counterparts. And we're able to see that having a much broader impact socially, from an economic perspective, and that's what we want. We want more economic stimulus in the economy so that we're able to see the money spread a lot wider. It lessens the burden on the social system, which at the moment South Africa has a very, very high dependency on the social system. So, through our efforts, we should be encouraging the use of the vehicles that we've got to be able to lessen the burden on the social system. We can talk volumes about this, about how do you take someone who's actually receiving zakat to paying zakat. That is an Islamic finance challenge. Yes, we've got our institutions to support us in fulfilling that work, but that's an Islamic finance challenge that we should be addressing. And, podcasts like this to educate ourselves, to say that is not something that by the way thought. It's very intricate about what you do with your money day to day. Is there longevity in that? Is there sustainability
100%.
in that?
I think that's also, like you said, it's a very big part of this podcast to bring that kind of awareness. And I think the more we do of this kind of work, to put it out there, because a lot of the times people are too busy to come and sit in a class or something. And I thought to myself, if I can bring it to them via YouTube and TikTok and Instagram and whatever else, it makes it easier for people to sit in their own space and learn from industry professionals like yourself. And it's now just for once you learn and you become aware, the next step is education. But you can't inspire education if you're not even aware that these things exist. And that's another big part of the podcast, is bring the awareness so people can come and have a conversation with us to educate themselves and then make better financial decisions. So I think this is also a good way to ask the next question, which is financial planning can sometimes seem like a dreaded task. So people don't know how to tackle it. And it's funny that a lot of people don't do this, whether it's budgeting, saving, or whatever else. The money comes in and it goes out like that, without thinking about it. And then, it's like hand to mouth living if you're not planning. So how do we then make it easier for people to understand financial planning and how to go about starting the journey of financial planning?
Yeah, so I think this is probably one of the greatest challenges that we all have. It's the reason why I find myself in the industry, because I think the opportunity as well as the work that's needed in this space is there's really a lot that's needed. I think for me personally, this is where technology and where we started the conversation about plays quite a significant opportunity in the space. I think podcasts like this, using platforms where we're able to distill the messages. We actually, as Al-Himayah, are working on an app, a mobile app, which talks about.
That's exciting.
It is, and I don't want to give too much away because you could probably do another podcast on that, But the app is there to be able to put tools in people's hands which are easily accessible to understand, your own Shari'ah compliance when it comes to financial affairs, and off the app be able to facilitate how you get access to financial advisors who are equipped to deal with Islamic finance matters. It's equipped for you to be able to pay your zakat directly from there.
Yeah.
So the technology, I think we have, we should be able to identify how we use that to distill this message and deal with challenges that we have within our midst.
It's very similar to what I'm trying to do here with the podcast, is bring it to the people, because we recognize you're busy. Beneficiaries are busy. I mean, even to just set a meeting with someone, they have to first look into the calendar. So if you can sit, like you say, you're creating an app, that's just making people's day-to-day living easier and not giving people an excuse anymore to say, I didn't know. These things that people like yourself, you are contributing to the the Islamic finance industry to make it easier for ourselves and the beneficiaries to make better financial decisions. So, but again, I just want to elaborate a little bit more. How do they start their journey to building the financial portfolio? Where do they? What's the starting point for anybody? Like practical examples, maybe.
Yeah. Look, I think if anyone who's exposed to the current financial advisor, ask the question. If you have a financial advisor, it's important to ask. Is my portfolio invested? If I have an investment portfolio, is it invested in Shari'ah products?
Yeah.
I think that's a question that one could tackle with very easily. So if I have an existing, how do I tackle that?
If I could then come back to the financial advisor, is it important to have a financial advisor? And because there's also again the negativity with financial advisors, brokers, certified financial planners, etc. Is it important to have one? Why should people consider having one? And how do you distinguish between the one that is just out to make the quick buck and the one that genuinely cares about you and your financial well-being?
I think here we're quite fortunate to be in a country like South Africa, which has a fantastic regulated financial sector. And if you look at the mechanics of financial services, it will tell you that, if the financial advisor is certified, is there to be in your best interest. Now, I mean, you've highlighted, we see a lot of bad examples of that, like any industry. You see the good and the bad. But if the person is, certified, they represent the license. Every financial advisor should be operating under a license. It's not just someone you met on the corner who understands the stuff. No, they actually need to write an exam that they need to undertake from a regulatory perspective, that they're there to give you the best advice. So those are some of the basic things as South Africans we should be looking for. To answer the question, it's always beneficial, no matter how much you have, what you have, to be able to talk to someone about financial affairs. And, strictly speaking, financial advisors should have the knowledge to be able to guide you. Right. Our South African regulation is tilting much towards them giving you advice versus selling you a product. Now we are journeying away from there. However, we're on the path of getting there. And, one should be able to talk to someone without feeling compelled to buy a product. Then your financial advisor is actually an advisor and is not just a salesman. So if they're prepared to give you that advice without necessarily making the sale at the end of the day, it perhaps could come based on your need, but it should be a decision you need to make. It shouldn't be forced on you. So, but I would definitely promote getting a financial advisor who understands that, and you can tell whether that person's, doing it for your interest or not. The character is very important. In fact, if you look at the South African regulation, it's not just competency. There's a character component to a financial advisor as well. And I mean, like you say, we're so busy, we don't even understand this, but these are some of the things that are underpinning the sector, which works in our favor. So it's always important to understand who you're dealing with. And if you have a financial advisor, then please, ask the question, I have particular needs. Like if I want to aim for a particular target in my investment portfolio, I have a particular need that it must be Sharia compliant. Can you verify that my selection of a product or, investment is in that? Then secondly, I think, reach out to companies like us. We're not the only financial institution who has access to Sharia funds. There's a number of them, and the number is getting more and more every day. Look out for companies like Al-Himayah, who does, specifically focus on Sharia products, and they are out there. And then I think generally, podcasts like this and digital access to information, you'll find most of your mainstream financial institutions in South Africa are now giving you Sharia options. Whether it's banking institutions, whether it's insurance institutions, a lot of them, if you go onto their websites and search Sharia, you will find it. Normally it's tagged as Sharia or Islamic, either of the two. Use them as words to be able to search and really look at what the options are from a product and solution point of view.
That's good. So it gives people an easy way to find. It's on the internet. And I think just to touch on the importance of the financial advisor, one of my friends told me, he's a certified financial planner, and also just to mention, becoming a certified financial planner, it's a process. It's like studying to become a CA or becoming a doctor. And just because you're not also a certified financial planner doesn't mean that you're not qualified, because there are tests that you have to go through as a financial advisor. That's what he was telling me. As a financial advisor, that would still allow you to give advice, but the journey is to get to CFP, certified financial planner. But he was telling me, when giving advice or doing the process and helping a person is much like a doctor. And this is how you can tell the difference between someone who's just a salesman and someone who's actually coming and cares about you and your financial well-being. The person comes and asks questions about you and what your need is. You first have to diagnose, like a doctor. Diagnose what's the problem, find out who you are, what your needs are, and then from there come up with a plan. And at this point, there was no product being discussed as yet. It was just understanding who are you and what is your needs, and how can we then utilize the tools, being the products and services that's available, in order to fix your problem or to solve for your problem, your gap in your financial plan. And I think that was such an interesting take on what a proper financial plan is supposed to be doing.
No, it's excellent. And I think that, that example that you used as a doctor, I would think, we would rather recognize those financial professionals as an extension of who we are and our families are. It's like a doctor. Often you have a family doctor, a family GP. Who's the family financial advisor? It's exactly that. And there has to be a strong element of a relationship with that individual. It can't be transactional. There's a relational aspect to have with the financial advisor who's doing what you're saying, who's doing it right. If it's transactional, then it's transactional. You're going to call them, you're going to buy something, and that's the end of it. A financial advisor, a proper financial advisor, should be a lot more than that. There should be a relational aspect. When you're thinking about buying a car, a house, or anything of that sort, you should be able to at least engage with that person to consider all aspects. And they should have a level of understanding of your situation and your circumstances to advise you best at that particular point in time. So the relationship component for me, Hassan, is probably the thing that it differentiates between a proper financial advisor and a salesperson.
That's what he was also saying. And and he also said, he made a very good point. He's saying, and it sounds like we're telling people, oh, you must go get a financial advisor. He told me, you don't actually have, the person can go out and they can go to the companies themselves. You can go directly to the company and go do your insurance, your investments, etc. But then you're running the risk of not making the right decision for yourself. Because now you are, imagine you self-diagnose your sickness. Now you have cancer. People go on Google and they go, look, I got these symptoms, and then Google spits out you have cancer. It's like,
we wouldn't want that.
You can't do that. Right? So similarly, on the financial planning side, you can go do it on your own, but then you run that risk of diagnosing yourself and giving yourself the wrong the wrong solution for your problem.
Absolutely.
And then you end up losing out. And a true financial advisor is going to try and guide you away from that.
Absolutely.
Right. I'm going to go to the next question. Okay. So we spoke about the importance or understanding how to start the journey of building a financial portfolio in a Sharia compliant manner. What would you say are some of the most essential components that should form part of everybody's financial portfolio?
So again, here I'd lean towards the practice of financial planning in South Africa generally looks at certain things. You get something that's called a 6-step financial planning process. In that process, it covers your basic needs, what we regard to as, in the event something were to happen that's unplanned or a risk event, are you actually protected for that? In the unfortunate incidents of your passing, do you have structures in place so that there's continuity for your family? Is your estate protected? Do you have a will? Those are some of your basic elements when it comes to your financial wealth planning. I think all of the listeners and the beneficiaries wouldn't want to be in a position where they leave a situation for their family or a difficult situation for their family in the event of their passing. So that is one of your basic needs. Do you have a will? And it's not just a financial need for us. From an Islamic perspective, we know the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam where he says you shouldn't be sleeping 2 nights without a will and a valid will. Am I correct? It's 2 nights?
Yeah.
Okay, you should know this. So, you look at that from a basic need point of view. It's one of the things that I would always advocate to ask anyone, do you have your will in place? And again, there's a Sharia compliant will that one could get. And I'm sure we all aspire towards our last wishes being in conformance to Islam and the Deen.
Yeah.
Then you look at those events that were unplanned, that could occur, that could put you or your family into a difficult position. In the event you lost a job, in the event you were disabled, in the event something occurred that wasn't planned for. Are those elements catered for and covered for? And if they are, and alhamdulillah, you still have excess money, then you go to the next level to say, what could I do with that to generate wealth? And then you look at investment opportunities. Now, part of that would be my retirement years. So there's structures in place for when I retire, what's the type of lifestyle I would like to have? Can I start saving towards that lifestyle? And inshallah, if you live to see those years, you're able to then enjoy a particular lifestyle. But that takes planning. It's not just going to happen by chance. So you have to think about that. And that's another need that I would always advocate for as a very basic element of life. And for those who have over and beyond, then it gets, to a different level about what do I do with this so that I could create wealth in a particular manner that grows, exponentially or whatever the case is. So there are tiers in how we look at this. And again, meeting the right financial planner, they'll be able to guide you around what that journey is.
Yeah.
But my advice, and maybe I should put a disclaimer, it's my own advice. This is not financial advice.
Yeah.
Because,
important
that
note.
would, that is a very important note.
This is an educational podcast.
It's an educational podcast, not a financial advice podcast. But, it is situational. But normally, we would always look at basic needs in terms of some risk events, and beyond that, go higher towards your discretionary needs. So start off with the things that could catch you out in life, that could set you back. Protect yourself against those, and from there, go into more sophisticated, advanced products, which allows you to explore and grow wealth.
Yeah. So from that, I took number 1, we need a will. Number 2 is we need to use our money wisely and put it in places that would allow us a kitty. So an investment, that emergency fund. So one of those, I've spoken to another friend of mine, he's at another organization, and he was saying, one of the go-to things that any person should have in their portfolio is a tax-free savings account. Because you get the tax-free growth on that as well. But that could be used as your emergency fund. And that is sort of basic, like you were saying. And then beyond that is things like planning for retirement. This is his words. I'm not going to mention names, but he's also in the finance industry. beyond the tax-free savings is planning for retirement, having a retirement annuity, making sure that you've got enough time to save towards that instead of starting later on in life where it becomes a little bit more expensive to do that. You have that in place. So that's what I took from him, and listening to what you're mentioning now as well. That just brought that to mind. And then beyond those things, it's how do I grow my wealth, which is what you just tapped on now. There's various what are the various Sharia compliant options to do that part. If they have excess wealth now, they got their will in place, they've got some of the takaful products in place, which is the Islamic insurance products for protection. They got tax-free and retirement annuity. What is some of the discretionary options?
So this has been one of the areas from a Islamic finance and a Sharia product development has really excelled. There's probably your most choice of Sharia compliant investment products or products available in the investment side of things. So here you've get, it depends on the asset classes. So normally you take an amount of money and you invest it in particular asset classes, and from there it grows. Those asset classes could vary into private equity, into shares, into money markets, into sukuk. And alhamdulillah, I think in South Africa, we've got option to all of those.
Yeah.
There's some very innovative products out there which even look at things like farming, as an industry where you're able to invest in the farming, and you don't only gain the growth on the profits from farming, but the asset is also listed. So you get a double growth because it's also on the stock exchange,
Yeah.
where you're able to get growth, and you're able to get growth from the sector in terms of farming as well. So there's a lot of options out there, Hassan, around what one could look at in terms of discretionary funds. What I would always caution against is, though, a lot of the time when we're looking to grow wealth, we look at quick options. And this is where it gets very tricky. You've got to be able to look at options which are registered, which are not going to put your money at risk. And unfortunately, this is another topic of which we must address. There's been unfortunate incidents where entities classify themselves as Sharia companies, but they didn't meet the regulation requirements. And, unfortunately, it led into disastrous outcome where they took funds away from people, for all the bad reasons that we know of.
Such a good point.
But this is something else we must bring to the surface and talk about, because we don't ever want to find ourselves in a situation where we're desperate and we think by making a Sharia decision, we go with a particular entity. And because we're so strict about making the right decision from a deen perspective, we don't go and check the registration of that company or the investment funds and so forth. And we end up putting our money at risk. That is something I think we must talk about. It's something we must put on the table. When you look at investment options, or any options when it comes to finances, make sure they're credible, they have certification, they're registered. Those things are there to protect us, not only as Muslims, but as South African citizens. So it's always important when we're looking at the investment options, there's lots of options out there, crypto, private equity, etc. Always look at institutions which are actually registered and you're not putting your money at risk. But alhamdulillah, I think in a South African environment, we're blessed with so many options. Private equity, shares, sukuks, structured funds, money markets. We have a myriad of options, and depending for someone's appetite in terms of risk, they could go aggressive or less aggressive, depending on their own personal appetite. But the options are quite vast.
Yeah. Sure, this was a action-packed episode, and I think there's a lot of benefit to take from this for the beneficiaries in terms of just a basic understanding of Sharia financial planning. And I think we stuck on the theme of the topic, which is how do you attain the pleasure of Allah through Sharia financial planning. And as you can see, beneficiaries can see that from this discussion, there's actually a lot that happened, transpired within the Islamic finance space and the Sharia financial planning space. When I say Islamic finance, I mean the products that is now being made available, that's being created within industry, and now having a dedicated business that is set to help Muslims or non-Muslims with their financial planning. And for for Muslims to have a one-stop shop. Basically, you go to this one place and they have all the different aspects of a financial portfolio all under one roof. I think that was a big takeaway for me from this discussion with Al-Himayah. And I think we're going to end the podcast on that point. And but before we end the completion of the podcast, just to remind the beneficiaries about Al-Himayah, who you are, what your purpose is, and who you aim to serve, and then any final closing thoughts from your side.
So firstly, Hassan, shukran for the opportunity. I think this was such a deep topic and, quite a vast topic. And it just shows how much there is to cover in something like this. And, I really value the opportunity for us to be able to talk about this. And although at times we were probably speaking quite widely, I hope we were able to bring it back to the core of it being around Islamic finance in general, as well as Islamic financial planning. So as Al-Himayah, I love the way you described it. We are a one-stop shop to be able to service all financial needs, from the things that we spoke about during the podcast, whether it's your basic risk needs in protecting you and your families, to take out wills, to invest your money. We're able to cover the full spectrum. So the best way to describe it, I would use your words, is to say it's the one-stop shop for Shari'ah financial planning.
Yeah.
I've touched on the future attraction of an app that we will be working with in terms of bringing that into people's hands and making it more accessible. We'll probably have another podcast on that and talk about that. But again, this is an area that Al-Himayah would want to play in terms of digitizing a lot of what's out there, bringing it to people at a very easy accessible, in an easy accessible manner. And Al-Himayah would want to position itself as that. We also have our own products, which we've developed for purposes of where there were gaps in the market. And I would really encourage, for those who don't know about us, look us up and be able to see what those products are and give us a call or reach out to us. We are available on, obviously, via website, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Those are our primary social media platforms. And look us up and interact with us around what your Sharia options are when it comes to financial planning. And then I look forward to just more podcasts of this nature to be able to talk about where we're going as an industry.
I think just as a final point, I think I forgot to ask, what efforts is Al-Himayah doing to ensure that the products and services are actually Sharia compliant? This is very important for beneficiaries to know.
So we're doing, firstly, our financial advisors are being exposed to Sharia training or Islamic finance training, where we actually have access to scholars internally within the business to support our financial planners with information that they have or they may need, to support what they're doing. Yeah. So as Al-Himayah, we work with scholars very closely to support our financial advisors to be able to give them the necessary support from an expert's point of view as to what is Sharia compliant versus not. We're also looking at developing products which are very unique to South African Muslim challenges, like saving for Hajj and Umrah, like saving for wedding days, like putting money away for an emergency event. Those are products that we have and we will continue to look at developing for specific Muslim needs.
Okay, and this all under the brand of Al-Himayah. Alhamdulillah. Any closing thoughts for the beneficiaries? What's the one thing, with your closing thought, what's the one or two things from this podcast that you think they should walk away with?
Yeah. I think if I had to answer that first before, my closing thoughts is, it's important that we always self-reflect on things. And one of the things we should be looking at is our financial affairs. And often we hear about, if it's not in order, it's probably too late for you, and it impacts those around you and those you love, your family, etc. So be able to take the time and just ask yourself the question around, are your financial affairs in order, in the event something were to happen? And if not, then what would I do about it? And, that for me is quite important, where you can work with people like us in being able to assist you. My parting thoughts, Ihsan, and, through this podcast also, hopefully we're able to see how vibrant the Islamic finance sector is in South Africa. And my appeal to all the beneficiaries out there is to in some way get involved, because it's a sector that's actually booming. It's a sector that's very vibrant. There's a lot happening, probably more than ever in South Africa right now when it comes to
Alhamdulillah.
Islamic finance
Yeah.
across the spectrum, whether it's in banking, takaful, insurance, medical aids, etc. It is absolutely vibrant. So for me, there's a need for more professionals to get involved in this, to work within this particular sector, and let's grow it. As we touched on in the podcast, it's not only for Muslims. This is a system, an alternate system that can benefit everybody. So how do we get more involved in the Islamic finance area in whatever way, whether it's through your technology expertise, whether it's in whichever way, even as doctors, lawyers, accountants, etc. How does my work actually impact Islamic finance, and how does Islamic finance impact me?
Yeah.
I would just encourage everyone to get involved in it, do a bit of desktop research on it, engage with people on it, because it's an absolutely vibrant sector.
Yeah, and for me, I'm always chasing the reward from Allah. Imagine being able to contribute to the industry and you pass away with that. Imagine the reward you're going to get from Allah to say, Allah, I've contributed in this way to your to the world, to benefit them, not just Muslims but people at large, using your principles, the Shari'ah. Oh, that's such an amazing way to end the podcast. So get involved and gain the rewards and the pleasure of Allah. Subhanallah. Alhamdulillah. Shukran so much for coming. I think I'll shake your hand on this. Long awaited, but I think you got there were some exciting moments out of this, and you look like you really enjoyed it. Alhamdulillah, I did, and hope to have another one because there's a lot more to discuss, inshallah. And until next time, peace.